Hi, my name is Caitlin, and I did my project on how deaf people play video games. That we tend to think of video games as a largely visual medium, and to an extent that's true, that for the most part we just rely on visual input in order to play games and to see what's going on. But there are a lot of audio components that we kind of tend to take for granted. For those of us that can hear, like music, sound effects, dialogue, all that stuff. But being deaf or hard of hearing is not as uncommon of a problem as people tend to think. That I found a couple of statistics, the first being that there was about 6.2% of the population that was either deaf or hard of hearing, and the second that there was 5.9% of the population that was deaf or hard of hearing. And so I'm gonna take a look at the experience of being deaf and playing video games, even though I'm not deaf or hard of hearing myself, and see what barriers exist in the gaming spaces for those people and how we can overcome them. Let's talk about some of the barriers that deaf and hard of hearing gamers face when entering a gaming circle. The first that people mentioned was a lack of being able to communicate, specifically with teammates in PvP or player versus player matches in games like Call of Duty, Rainbow Six Siege, that kind of thing, where matches are often decided by really snappy, quick judgments and being able to communicate with your teammates. And if you can't hear your teammates through voice chat, that can cause a lot of issues. The second barrier is a lack of subtitles on cutscenes or just character dialogue in general. And this doesn't only affect people with disabilities. That Ubisoft released some statistics about subtitle use in their games, the first being that 95% of players that played Assassin's Creed Odyssey kept subtitles on. And for Far Cry New Dawn, that was 97% of players. And if you compare that to the 6.2 or 5.9% of people in general that are deaf, that there's a bit of a skew there. So a lot of people that don't have a hearing disability also use subtitles. The other barrier is audio cues, specifically for things like horror games that require binaural audio in order to hear what direction a monster is coming from. That if you don't have access to that binaural audio, that can cause your character to die a lot, you can get frustrated and quit. And the other barrier to entry is music. That we tend to take for granted the soundtracks that are in the backgrounds of the games that we play, but the dramatic tension and the emotional impact of the music that we listen to can have a big impact on how we experience games. And so for people that can't hear that, it's important to explore other avenues for emotional expression. As far as solutions, thankfully there are a lot of cool and interesting projects in the works. Like, one that I found particularly interesting was EA is working on an AI that they call Ava, which turns player speech to text in chat form. So when you're playing PvP games and you need to communicate with teammates, Ava will take your speech and write it down so that people who either don't have access to a mic or are hard of hearing can still participate in the discussion and see what's going on. And having used, the other direction, text to speech instead of speech to text, I can tell you how cumbersome and long that process is, and so seeing improvements to that technology would be a welcome change. The next thing was closed captions versus regular captions. That having subtitles on things is important, but it's also really important to have closed captions, which includes background noise and narrates other things in the environment and not just character dialogue. So if something is dropped in the background or if there's music, there can be text that signifies that that's happening to alert people that can't hear, as opposed to people that just need to augment what they're hearing. And for subtitles, the correct size that they need to be is about 8% of the height of the screen in order to be readable to the general population. And so I'll have an infographic up here to show you the scale of that's about how big the text would need to be. The next solution involves directional cues and visual cues in games. Like The Last of Us Part 2 has directional arrows that they put in addition to dialogue to show you which direction an enemy is speaking from, so that if you can't hear, or if you have the volume turned off, you can still see where the enemies are in the environment based on where they're talking from, which is really helpful. The last thing involves sensory input other than audio to augment the gaming experience. So for people that can't experience music in games, it can be helpful to have things like a vibrating controller. So I know for Ghost of Tsushima in particular, there's a section where you can feel a character's heartbeat through the controller, and that floored me the first time I experienced that, and I feel like that would add a lot more to the emotional impact of the scene, even for people that couldn't hear the bombastic soundtrack in the background. There are lots of avenues for exploration that don't just involve audio input. Well, thanks so much for listening. Here are my sources that I used in my paper and in my speech. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. Thanks.